I've always been impressed by failure versus success. That in America, a land of opportunity and a horn of plenty, that we should find so many who apparently are not successful. I guess, like so many of us, I've looked at a lot of books and tried to listen to a lot of speakers to ascertain what is this nebulous, mysterious thing called success. I heard a definition not too long ago that really put together a lot of pieces for me. If you were to put failure at one end of a spectrum and success at the opposite end, we tended to know that in all of your functionings, be they sales functions, business functions, personal functions, or what have you, that you would tend to place yourself mentally on the spectrum between failure and success. And yet when we got to thinking about it, if we could anatomize what success really was, we came to a conclusion that, as I've mentioned, helped me understand it a little better. I know an awful lot of you have been reading a book, and at any given time as you were reading, you may have had it dawn upon you that, wow, you hadn't understood or cognated on anything you'd read for the past paragraph or perhaps the past page. I guess we've all had that experience. And if you could, at that moment, go back in the book to the last point where you understood what it was you read, more often than not, you'll find that the thing that caused you to blank out, to literally drop out in your attention on that reading, was the fact that you had skipped over a misunderstood word. And if you didn't get the word handled and clarified, if you couldn't understand, the obvious thing happened. You blanked out on everything else you read. And as we looked at that concept, it became apparent that that perhaps was the genesis of all dropout. Not only dropout in attention from reading a book, but perhaps dropout from school itself. And maybe we could even be so bold as to say dropping out from life itself. Going past a misunderstood. Let me see if I can give you some examples. I remember as a kid growing up in Casper, Wyoming, I literally was raised in a white ghetto. And the thought had been brought to my mind that if ever in my lifetime I could ever earn as much as $500 in any given month, wow, that had to be big heaven. Didn't really recollect that it would be possible for a human being to earn as much as $500 in a month. And it took me as long as it took me to be able to earn $500 in a month. That's the beauty of learning anything. It takes as long as you want it to. But that day came when I earned $500 in a month, and then my imagination really started to run rampant. I suppose I just wondered, would it even be possible to earn as much as $500 in 2 weeks? And that, too, took me as long as it took me. And then I really started to expand my thinking. And would it even be a remote possibility that a kid from Casper could earn as much as $500 in a week? And then when I did that, I really got excited. Oh, come now. Was it really even a remote possibility that $500 in a day could be realized? And then I really started pumping when I got to thinking, what about $500 for a speech? Now, had someone walked up to me those many years ago and said, hey, Gardner, not only will you earn as much as $500 in a month, but we will tell you that you will experience earning $500 in 20 minutes, I'm sure I would have thought they were nuts. You see, they would have had me skip too many gradients. And maybe those are the words that we look for. It's the concept of the skipped gradient that has caused most of us to stumble and fall. The unwillingness or the not knowingness that causes us to skip over a gradient base. And whenever we skip a gradient, we experience what we call failure. We have to take those intermediate steps in order to accommodate our thinking to allow us to do more. That's why pie in the sky can't and won't work. The gradient base of taking things one step at a time to grow. Well, let me give you another example out of the financial area. Like so many of you, I'm an avid football fan. I've watched those gladiators of the gridiron do their thing. And yet, whenever I see a flanker speeding down the sidelines, leaping for the pass and pulling up lane, it's apparent to me that one thing has happened. That guy, that flanker, never tried that hard in practice. In the game, he stretched beyond and he skipped some physical gradients and consequently experienced failure. Well, I could even give you a better example that most of us have experienced. When you first met her, I don't think you walked up and said, "Hi, sweetheart, how about it?" Now, you may have. Of course, I don't know you. But if you're like most of us, I imagine you walked up and you said hi and you introduced yourself, and then eventually you started the gradient base. You held her hand. And after you found out that that didn't hurt and it was okay, maybe you sneaked your arm around her. And that was even better, and now your imagination started to run rampant with you. And you would even go so far as to snuggle up with her and put your head on her shoulder. And once you'd taken that gradient basic step, then maybe, just maybe, with wild anticipation, you would plant a kiss on her cheek. And then all of a sudden, maybe somehow or another, the big embracing hug that could come as a gradient step beyond that. Hey, pal, I know what you're doing. We both know that you were headed for the same place all the time. But the second method assured you greater success because you didn't skip any gradients. You see, as I see it today, the difference between failure and success in any endeavor is the willingness, as we say in American business, to pay the price, as it were, which is just another fancy way of saying, don't skip any gradients. The skipped gradient is one of the greatest cognitions you might have to enable you to experience more of what we call success and eliminate more of what we call failure. And as I looked at that understanding perhaps became the answer as to what it was that caused so many of us in selling to experience difficulty with what should have been very obvious. In putting on a lot of programs, one of the most often requested speeches, which I give, is the speech on time control, time organization. And yet when I talk to managers, all of them say, gee, everybody knows how very important time control is. And yet, despite the fact that we all know how very important it is, the overwhelming fact remains. Most of us don't know anything at all about time control. Isn't it odd? Maybe we've skipped some gradients. And as I looked at that to try to analyze why effective utilization of time and effort was the #1 failure factor for those of us involved in selling, it dawned on me that yes, in fact, we had skipped a lot of gradients. We had gone past some misunderstoods, and consequently from passing over the misunderstood words and not getting them defined and those beautiful concepts of what time is and what control is, we ended up dropping out. So I would hope in this tape that if we did nothing but gave you a greater awareness of where we're coming from in terms of defining your base, that alone will go a long way toward helping you take another gradient step. So let's get into this. Time control. I'm generally amazed as I ask my audiences to talk with me and work with me, and I ask the first question, what is time? Well, think about it. What is time? If I were to give you a moment to put down in writing your definition of this thing that everybody knows about, what would you say time is? Huh. More difficult than you imagined, isn't it? But everybody knows what time is. Why would you ask a question like that? Well, what is time? I gain a lot of funny answers. I've had people say to me, time is money. Well, is it? If I said to you, time is money, and defined my base as that, would you know what I meant when I said time control? Gee, maybe now I'm talking about money control. Some of the other things people say to me, time is the essence of life. Time is the only thing we have. Time is the amount of service we give to others. I've heard up and down the pike multiple answers on what time is. And good people, therein lies the problem. I imagine if we have 20 people trying to define time, we would have 20 different definitions. And if in fact we have 20 different definitions, why is it difficult to understand that we misunderstand? We don't know what time is. So let me give you, maybe for the first moment of your life, a perception, as it were, a realization, an experience of what time is all about. My functional definition that I'll use for the remainder of this tape is as follows. Time. Time is the measurement of space between events. That's all. May sound scientific. You may say, wait a minute, I don't know that I understand. Well, let's talk about it. Time is a measurement of space between events. So when I talk about time control, I want to talk about controlling the amount of space we put between events. That's my base of operation. Now, let me give you a perception on it. I've said it is the measurement of space between events. What do I mean by space? I'd like you to try an experiment with me at this moment. Put your feet square on the floor. Be sure that you don't rustle any papers. Don't knock the tape recorder. Just relax for a moment and see if you might experience what time is all about. When I say go, simply close your eyes. Once again, don't worry about turning off or on the recorder. Just let it run. And as you close your eyes, concentrate on the amount of space that you will experience. And then when I say okay, you can open your eyes and we'll start up again. When I say now, close your eyes and hold on. Ready? Now. $15 seconds. One minute. Wake up. It took forever, didn't it? 60 long seconds. It's that amount of space between the time when I said now and when I said wake up that you and I have agreed to call a minute. That's all. It's that amount of space. So now we talk about the measurement of space between events. Maybe you start to get a handle on what I mean. So yes, time is the measurement of space between events. In that case, two events. The first event, the word now. The second event, the words wake up. So now let's see how that applies to you and me as we sell down the street. In order to understand time control, maybe I have to define control. I've heard a lot of definitions about control, but the best functional definition I've ever heard is one that I picked up from Scientology. They simply gave what they called the anatomy of control. What is the anatomy of control? If you will, write down three words. Put the words start, change, and stop. You see, start, change, and stop constitutes what is known as a cycle. Now, you may put after those three words in parentheses two other words that are very critical to the understanding of time control. In the parentheses, put the two words at will. So now we've said that control is nothing more or less than the ability to start, change, and stop at will, whatever it is you're doing. That is a cycle, and it's your job, in order to control what you do, to complete cycles. For example, if you go out and put the key in your automobile and turn it and it starts, hey friend, you're in control. If you're driving down the road and you turn left and the car does in fact turn left, you're still in control. If you come to the edge of the curb and you turn off the key and the car does stop, you're in control. But now what happens if you go out and put that key in the car and you turn it, and you're like me, you don't know much mechanically beyond that. You turn the key, but it doesn't start. No control there. Or if you're driving down the road and you turn to the left, but the car goes straight, you've got a problem. Or if you pull over to the side and you turn the key off, and like some Fords, it goes and it won't stop. You see, if we cannot start, change, and stop at will, we do not possess control. So once again, that cycle of start, change, stop is what we're talking about. So what is time control? Stick them together. For you and me to control our time as functioning salesmen, we have to have a great ability to change, to start, to stop, at will, the amount of space we put between events. Gee, I've heard it said all my life that if you want to get a job done, you give it to a busy man. Why? Nobody said the busy man was going to do it better, but the one thing we do know, a busy man will complete cycle. He will do more of those things and complete more cycles and be able to control what it is that he handles. That's a very important consideration to understand. Incidentally, in selling, whenever we find a salesman who has difficulty starting the selling cycle, what do we call that? Well, we call it call reluctance. He's the guy who somehow or another cannot start a cycle to go out to sell. They call reluctance, and perhaps then symptomatically we may tag him as lazy or indifferent or use words such as those. But now what about the guy who can't change? What do you call a salesperson who can't change? Well, you call him inflexible. You call him the old-timer. You call this guy pig-headed. He's a person who has an inability to roll with the punch when a policies and procedures manual is changed, when prices fluctuate, when due dates and orders aren't filled on time. He has a real inability to handle change. And then symptomatically in selling, when you have a person who doesn't know how to end cycle, has no reality with how to stop, we say that person is a poor closer. So all we really have to talk about in closing is teaching people how to end cycle. That's why it is so imperative on that tape on closing that I've said closing is not getting a yes necessarily. Closing is the gaining of a commitment. A yes or a no will help you end cycle. Nothing will cause you more problems in selling than those people who will not allow you to end cycle. They're the ones who always say, let me think about it. And by saying to you, let me think about it, it leaves your cycles uncompleted. And if you have too many uncompleted cycles, that, incidentally, is the definition of confusion. Confusion defined is nothing more or less than random motion. Uncompleted cycles, too much flux and movement involved in the particles of your life. I remember the first time I went to New York City, and I stood out on 57th Street. The cars were zooming, the people were walking, all of this particle flow, and I don't mind telling you, I was confused. Anytime you have too much random motion, confusion will result. And yet I know everybody listening to this tape wants to know, how do you get out of confusion? Obviously, we're confused when too many buyers say, I want to think about it, and we can't seem to generate sales. Obviously, we get confused when there's too much random motion anywhere. How do you get out of confusion? By one of the most dynamic concepts I've ever heard in my life. There is a way out of confusion. There's a way out of selling confusion. There's a way out of personal confusion. There's a way out of any kind of confusion. The way out is by the establishment of a stable datum. Now, what in the world do I mean by a stable datum? Well, a stable datum is just what its words imply. Stable, like an anchor, and datum. Datum is a singular, one piece of information. So you take one thing and one thing only to become your anchor point, your point of reference, if you will. And anytime you'll do that, you'll blow an awful lot of confusion. Let me give you an example. I was doing a series of meetings for General Motors on the dealership level. I walked into one dealership one morning early, about 7:30, arrived before the salesman, and witnessed confusion at its best. The general manager was on the telephone. There was a young 19-year-old girl at the switchboard. She was not the regular girl. She was relieving until the regular switchboard operator came to work. The general manager was on the telephone, and all of a sudden that switchboard lit up like Christmas present. All of the lights got to flashing, the wires were intertwined as you've seen them on PBX boards, and inadvertently the little girl pulled the cord on the general manager. Oh, was he hot. He came storming out of his office, walked over to that PBX board, and just dumped his bucket all over that little girl. She clouded up and got to crying and jumped up and ran over to the Jane, really upset. And I sat there and witnessed all of this. Well, an older gal came out and took over the board. The manager, violating every management principle we know that you don't criticize in public, stormed back into his office. Well, a few moments passed, and pretty soon the door to the Jane opened, and out stepped a puffy-eyed, upset little girl. I motioned to her and asked her to come on over, which she did rather reluctantly. And I said, honey, would you like to learn how to control that board? She said, I don't know if I ever want to see it again. She was really upset. I said, no, now let's calm down and see if we can confront this problem. Would you like to learn how to control the board? Well, she thought so. So we walked over. The older lady was very gracious to let her have another chance.
This concludes side 1. Now please fast forward the cassette to the end, turn it over, and you'll be ready for side 2.